So, hi, Martha. Thank you for joining Right with Impact.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you on the podcast. Um, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself a little bit, but I just want to note you are the author of a new book, Writing on the Job: Best Practices for Communicating in the Digital Age. Um, Before we talk about your new book, which I'd love to dive into, tell us a little bit about yourself. I understand you are a lecturer at the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University and also an adjunct professor of law at New York University School of Law.
That's right. And due to the magic of Amtrak, I'm able to do that from Washington, D.C., which is where I'm based. So my career has been in and outside of government. I've worked on Capitol Hill is where I started my career right out of college. I spent nearly a decade as an advocate working in a nonprofit and then worked for 6 years in the White House before leaving to start teaching and consulting, which is what I do now.
Right. And what kind of teaching do you do?
So at Princeton, I teach in the School of Public and International Affairs in the master's program. So these are people often who've had several years of work experience who are coming back to get a master's to do something either in government or in the nonprofit sector. And I teach some courses in domestic policy, which is my area of expertise. So I teach a course in the federal budget and a course on poverty and public policy, and also something I call legal skills for policymakers. I have a JD and I do in 6 weeks what I was taught to do in 3 years, probably not as well as the 3-year version, but I try to pack in the best of law school into a 6-week course. But then I started teaching writing as a complement to that, and that's really where the book came from.
That's fantastic. So I'd love to dive into your book, Writing on the Job: Best Practices for Communicating in the Digital Age. Congratulations on the publication of your book.
Thank you.
Yeah, so just tell us, first of all, why did you decide to write this book? You're very busy, obviously a very busy career, as you teach public policy and law. And why did you decide to write a book, and who's this for?
Great questions. So I started to, it's funny, the reason I ended up writing the book was that I started teaching writing. I taught a course at Princeton and now I teach regular workshops, and I was looking around for the book to use. I thought, oh, there must be a good book. And there are lots and lots of them. I have a shelf behind me of 100 of them, but there wasn't one that was quite what I felt that my students needed as early career professionals making the transition from writing in an academic setting to writing at work, where being, writing short and writing efficiently and all of those things is what's prized. There was a book actually that I loved that was written by a couple advertising executives, but it was about 20 years old and it had some funny references to fax machines and other things that are mostly gone from the world. So at some point I thought, well, if the book I want to assign isn't out in the world, maybe I should write it. And that's where it came from. I'd already developed a lot of material for the classroom, tested things out with my students, so I had some sense of what advice resonated and didn't. And I started putting that into a book, into a book proposal, and then into a book.
That's fantastic. I'd like to dive in, before we dive into some of the strategies, the writing strategies and advice that you give in your book. Just tell us a little bit about the process of writing the book. How did you put it together? How did you, outline it, draft it, write it, and edit it?
Sure. And I should have said, you asked also who it's for, even though the primary audience is young professionals. I wrote it in a way, and I'll get to the writing of it just a sec. I wrote it in a way that I wanted it to be useful to people who were mid-career or even later in their careers, who might get handed a new kind of writing assignment. Like, now you have to give a speech, or you have to start writing performance reviews, or you need to write for social media. And those forms of writing might be somewhat new to you, depending on what the earlier part of your career looked like. So even though I had mostly people like my students in mind, the idea is that the book would be useful to people at any stage in their career, or even who just want to, brush up and get better at it. We are all on, I believe, a lifelong journey of improving our writing. None of us are perfect at it or ever will be. But the process was, first of all, I had to learn how you do this, right? I didn't know anything about publishing a book, and I got some good advice from a few trusted people and discovered that, at least for nonfiction, you don't have to have the full manuscript, but you have to have a table of contents, various other things in a book proposal, and at least a couple chapters. So I sketched out what I thought should be in the book. I wrote a few chapters, and then I had a book proposal that I was talking to a few publishers about, and ultimately ended up being published by the Princeton University Press, which is a wonderful academic press that also publishes books that are sort of to the trade more broadly. It's not just books for academic audiences. And this is a book that crosses over. It's something that could be used in universities and colleges, but also I think the primary audience is out in the business world.
Right. Exactly. Well, congratulations. How long did it take you, just out of curiosity?
So I benefited in some way by the unfortunate incident of the pandemic, because when I was at the point where I needed to start writing those remaining chapters was when I was locked in my home with my family and my pet, and not a lot to do other than to sit down on a very deliberate schedule and start writing these chapter by chapter, week by week. So I've never done the calculation. I don't want to, because I think if I took my book advance and divided it by the number of hours I spent working on it, I'm well sub minimum wage. But it was doable. It was doable because I had material and ideas to put in there. And of course, then you don't just write. I mean, with any writing, you don't just write, you also show it to lots of people and get feedback. So the revising was also a substantial amount of time, but it was kind of a joy because I got great feedback that made it better and better. And ultimately it was good enough to go out into the world.
That's right. Writing is rewriting.
Yes.
So yeah, so tell us, you start off with talking about understanding your audience. I think that's a good place to start. And then you talk about, getting started, writing the draft, and editing. And then you also talk you write later in the book about, different forms of writing. But let's start at the very top, who you're writing for. When you sit down and you're about to write something, it could be anywhere from an email to a business proposal to a blog post to a book.
Yeah.
How do you think about understanding your audience? Because it may not be very clear. You may be very amorphous, sort of. So tell us, how do you do it? I'd rather hear it from you.
Yeah. But I'm sure you have thoughts on this too. So I think this is one of the most important things, and one of the earliest things you need to do before you start writing something or before you start getting very far, is asking yourself that question about audience. Unless the first two words in what you're writing are Dear Diary, you are writing with the purpose of communicating and connecting with someone else. It's not a vanity project. So you have to put yourself in the shoes of the person you think will be reading this and ask, what do they need to hear? What do they want to know? So the first question is the who question, which you were alluding to. Who am I writing to? And the most difficult kind of writing is when it's lots of different kinds of people. It's sort of like giving a presentation to an audience of very mixed understanding of an issue. That's the most challenging. But usually, if you're writing a business proposal or an email or any internal document, you kind of know who your audience is. You can picture them, you know what they care about. So then I always ask myself two questions. Once I figure out who that group of people is, who is that primary audience, what do they know and not know? Because you don't want to pack your writing full of things they already know. On the other hand, you don't want to assume a bunch of knowledge that they don't have. And you are in the difficult position of knowing a lot about the topic, and that curse of knowledge is real. Sometimes you don't realize that you know things other people don't know. So you really have to stop and say, okay, what do I need to provide in this piece of writing as background? It's fine to say things like, as you may know, or as you may recall, and then put something in that maybe they knew, maybe they didn't, but it would be a problem if they continued reading and didn't have that background piece. But some notion of kind of what people know and don't know. That's the first question. And then the second question is, what does your audience care about? Especially if you're trying to write something persuasive, whether that's public-facing commentary in an op-ed or a blog, or something internal. I always remind my students that there may be a set of reasons that you think something is important to do, but the more important set of reasons are the ones that your audience will find compelling, right? And your boss might care about different things than you do. Write the memo based on the things your boss cares about, not the things that you personally, that drive your passion about the issue or drive your belief that something really matters. The one other thing I'd say about audience, just as a preliminary matter, is that this kind of gets into readability, but people often write in a way that is just difficult to get through. And one of the important things about the audience is you want something to be easy, especially for the general public, for them to consume. So there are lots of readability tests out there and online tools you can use, some of them built into the software you may write on. But in general, in the US, for example, we say it's good to aim for an 8th grade reading level at most. And it's surprising, people often think that means somehow reducing the, nuance in their ideas. And I think it's the opposite. I think it helps you add clarity to your writing if you try to write it for someone who can read it at an 8th grade level rather than at a more advanced level of education. In fact, if you look at some of the best speeches that have ever been given, they're written often at more like a 4th grade reading level. And again, it's not that they're babyish. It's just that the sentence construction is simple enough that it's easy for the listener to follow. And again, that's what you want. The whole point of writing or giving a speech is communication. And if it's easier for your audience to absorb the words that are coming across, it's going to be more compelling and more persuasive. So I always, whether it's the Hemingway app or it's something built into your Microsoft Word, I always tell people the first thing to do if you're not sure what you've written is great is look at what's your grade level. And the Hemingway app, which I really like, it's a website you can just copy and paste a block of text into, not only tells you what grade level you are, but it spots your long sentences. Long sentences are often the impediment to comprehension. So it kind of gives you a little bit of a clue of how to knock down your prose to the point where it's easier on the reader.
You teach a lot of very smart students at Princeton and at NYU Law School. I would imagine it's a real challenge for some of them or many of them to take what they are trying to write and communicate, where they may have a habit of writing long, complicated sentences full of maybe a lot of technical jargon and trying to simplify that. Tell us just a little bit more about that challenge in the classroom and what your recommendation is. How do you persuade them to actually change the way they write?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I don't know. I hope that maybe partly I walk in with some credibility having done it myself. So if I say this is the right way to do it, they believe me. But beyond that, I think one of the things I often point them to is how journalists write, right? They don't think of, especially journalists, in fancy, well-regarded publications that, I know journalists have mixed reputations population-wide, but they're pretty smart people who write about complex subjects in a simple way. And I point out to them that good journalism is not full of all that jargon and those abstract words. Their whole job is to be clear and to get to the point, which is one of the big takeaways from my book, is the strategy of bottom line up front, which is a term I think developed by the US military for briefing, which is first you say the point of everything you're saying and then you unpack it. That's sort of how journalists write, the inverted pyramid. So I try to point out to them that great journalistic writing is really accessible, and that's why people are able to read it so easily. And the same thing for busy policymakers. If you write something that flows as nicely as a newspaper or magazine article, you're probably in the zone and that where a policymaker, who's the audience my students are mostly trying to reach, but it could be a business executive, either way, that they can absorb it.
Right. What about getting started, I think, and writing your first draft?
Yeah, so what I offer in the book is a set of options, sort of strategies that all of which have worked for me in some way. But what I find is, we're all individuals. So something will work well for me that might not work well for you, Glenn, and might not work well for someone else. So I give kind of a menu of options on getting started, for example. So the book has a chapter called Getting Started, and it's sort of a menu of options, things that have worked for me or worked for people I know in how to get over that hump of the first draft. One piece of advice in there, though, that I think is fairly universal is to start early. I think this is true even of writing something short like an email. I find that if I draft something, an email, I'm better off letting it sit in the draft folder for at least 5 minutes and then coming back to it, because what I often find is just with that little bit of distance, I'll notice a mistake I made or something I meant to mention that I didn't, and just creating that separation improves the product. So if that's true of an email, imagine it being a speech or a slide deck or a memo or a report. Starting early gives you the time to then be able to set it aside and come back to it. So getting started for me means getting started early. But beyond that, I have, a different kinds of advice that I give. I'm a big fan of outlining. I call it bullet outlining. I don't think you need to have full Roman numerals unless that's your thing. But before you've even something fairly short, if you can jot down 3 bullet points that are the points you want to get across in this communication, whatever it is, you're probably going to have a better structured and more logical piece of writing if you've done a little bit of outlining first. So I'm a big fan of that. The other thing I often suggest for people when they're trying to get started, especially if they feel stuck, is to use their voice. I have yet to find a student or a professional colleague who feels stuck on something who can't tell me if I say, well, what's the thing you're supposed to be writing about? People can start talking. So talk it to someone, I always say, or talk it into your phone and record it. It gets you going. There's always ideas in your head. I think it's just the blinking cursor that sometimes leads us to be a little bit paralyzed, but your voice often can get you going. So that's my advice on how to get started as a first matter.
That's great. And then, just writing your first draft. I mean, once you've got your outline, how do you sort of hammer out that first draft?
Yeah. So again, here, there's different techniques that may resonate more with different readers, but a couple of things that I encourage people to do. One is that it's fine to leave blanks as you write. I think sometimes people think they have to write start to finish. And sometimes, let's say you've done a little outline, it's point 3 that you feel most mentally ready to write up. And that's what's kind of brimming in your head. So write that and leave the blanks that say, paragraph 1 goes here, or this point goes here, XXX. I do everything. What I do is I bracket things with big X's and I highlight them in yellow. So I can't possibly turn in a final with that yellow stuff in it because I will notice it and fill it in. So I always say, like, when you get started, it's fine to start anywhere in your document as long as you have a logical outline. I'm a big fan of keeping both sentences short, which you talked about a little bit, but also paragraphs short. So I think if you're writing something, you should be giving your readers some breaks and create some white space. Don't have your paragraphs be too long. So that's one way to think about letting your writing flow. Another thing I strongly recommend in the book is thinking of ways to illustrate the ideas that you're sharing as you work on that first draft. If you're describing something, especially something at all complicated, you should stop and add a sentence that says, for example, or imagine that, and then illustrate the point. Don't assume that your reader has the same depth of comprehension and all those examples brimming in their heads. They probably don't. And honestly, it can test your understanding of something. If you write something and then you can't fill out that for example sentence, you may not understand your own concept as well as you think you do. Or you may need to adjust it. You may actually not be saying the right thing. So that's a part of what I suggest to people is kind of jump around, make sure your paragraphs aren't too long, illustrate your ideas, make sure that bottom line up front appears in your whatever document you're writing that you're drafting in that first draft. Those are some of the basics that I share in the book.
No, that's great. And then editing, how do you take that draft and polish it and make it ready to hit send or hit publish?
Yeah. So here too, there are different ways I find that people go about this, and they're all fine. It's all about finding what works best for you. I'm a big fan of printing out a hard copy. I think just taking it off the polished, glowing brilliance of your screen and putting it into the black and white of a page, things look different to you. You read it at a different pace, and you just notice things that you might not notice if it's always living on your screen. We can scroll fast past errors, but it's harder when we're going line by line in a printed copy. So I always do that for anything important. Before I submit a report or any other document at work, I'll print it out. The other thing I'll do that probably sounds a little crazy is I will also read it out loud. You can get Microsoft Word and probably other software will do this too. You can get your software to do this for you. And the intonation's not bad. Actually, the technology's gotten a lot better. I still like to read it myself, or even just for a paragraph. If there's part of something that I think just doesn't seem quite right, if I read it aloud to myself, I find myself tripping over the awkward parts and I immediately realize, whoa, this sentence is too long, or I got to move something. This isn't right. This is where the problem is. So that's another way that I edit, is just try to read it aloud. And then I start to find the the mistakes. But there are lots of other sort of more basic editing strategies that I talk through in the book. Strunk and White's advice to omit needless words is so, so true. I have a list in the book of like the book's words to look for as a starting point, like the apparently, basically, essentially, is there's so many of these little qualifiers that don't really do much, that, you know, that you can just sort of look for in your writing and get rid of. A big one actually is the word that. In American English, often we can just get rid of the word that. It's not needed nearly as often as we think. So that's the one way you can just sort of strike a whole bunch of words out. But anyway, I've got a discussion in the book, long list of words to look for, just to tighten it up. A lot of what our first drafts are often verbose, like the sentences are too long, we have extra words, and culling those out is a big part of it. Getting rid of jargon, you mentioned, that's a big thing that you have to do in editing, is kind of go back through and see, is there business speak that your audience might not understand or might find irritating? Are you using abbreviations that people might not readily understand? I also really encourage people to read their drafts and think like a critic. Imagine someone who does not like you and does not trust you reading what you've written. Does it pass their test? And if it doesn't, there's probably some parts that you have a little bit, like a LinkedIn post, for example, or something else that you're publishing that feels a little bit not well supported, or maybe you've stretched. And if you imagine the critic on your shoulder, that's the point that they're going to say, hey, Glenn, hey, Martha, I don't buy this. And that leads you to kind of go back and work more on that piece. So the book talks about the grammar stuff, you know, the commas, apostrophes, all those things. But mainly what my book isn't a book about grammar. It's about all these other ways that we can edit our work to make them sharper.
Right. That's fantastic. And the title of your book, Writing on the Job, Best Practices for Communicating in the Digital Age, leads us to, writing formats. And you cover a number of different formats, styles of writing. Let's focus a little bit on this term digital age. How has writing, how do you have to think about that? How do you have to think about sort of the platform or the channel or the technology you're using when writing? And then after we cover that, I am curious to understand, what you think about generative AI and Chat GPT. But before we get to that big topic, I'm just curious, how you think about how you approach, or how you, with your students, and in your book, how you talk about writing for the digital age.
Yeah. So I think the biggest change in the digital age is that so many people are reading on handheld devices of some kind, right? They could well be reading something you're sending, not just messages, but other documents on a smartphone or a tablet or something else. And I always tell my students, like, you've got one screen. And when you have one screen, meaning before the person might swipe away, move on to the next thing, you cannot count on people to read to the end. Now, that was true of paper documents too, but I think it's even more so. It's easier to swipe and move along than it used to be when you had a stack of correspondence or memos or something on your desk back in that era. So that to me puts a premium on either the subject line or the headline, whatever it is. I say this even on for slides that you're doing or data visualizations, the heading should tell you the point of the slide or the point of the data visualization that you're sharing. These things should not be unpacked slowly like some sort of mystery. You have to put that takeaway message right up front, because you just don't know if the person's going to, stop scrolling, go on to the next thing. So it also means that, for example, if there's an ask in something that you're communicating, again, back to email or other kinds of messaging, that has to go up front too. I'm writing to ask if you are able to go to this meeting at this time, or if you can review this document by this date. You can't bury the, like, what am I supposed to do about this and when part of your message way at the end. So again, it's just really thinking about how you use that real estate, and also breaking up the blocks of text. I think that was true even not in the digital age, but even more so, we've come to expect things to have bullets and to be, again, broken up in a reader-friendly way. Use bolding, other cues that make the material easier for us to absorb. That's what we're used to when we're looking at websites and social media. And so when something comes to us in the work world, it's more friendly if it looks like that rather than just a very long block of text.
Absolutely. That's all very useful advice. I completely agree. and I see it as sort of an inexorable trend. I see it on LinkedIn. I see it everywhere, and yet, not everybody puts it into practice. So I think it's
Yeah.
just good advice, and it's something that I think everyone should put into practice themselves. Chat GPT, more broadly of generative AI, is has sort of burned up the internet over the past couple of months, and it's supposedly only going to get more powerful. I've been listening to some podcasts and reading some articles about the beta testers of Chat GPT powered Bing, the search engine by Microsoft, and supposedly that is even more powerful than what we're seeing on Chat GPT. So tell us, what are you hearing in the classroom? What are you seeing? And, what's your take on this?
I'm still thinking through what my views are, but I have been reading some of what you're reading. I have been playing around with it myself because it's irresistible and you learn things when you do. I mean, I think your point is that these things, you can't stop them. So you have to be, I think what we've learned from some earlier eras of technology innovations that we sort of didn't see the dark side of early enough is that let's be smart about this and watch for the things it does that are not helpful, that facilitate misinformation or what have you, or that are, now there's stories about how rude and offensive this bot has gotten and all of that. But my bottom line is it's going to be here. So we may as well figure out, rather than fearing it, see it as an opportunity to make our work lives easier. And I do think, I talked about that getting started, staring at the blinking cursor problem. Well, it solves the blank page problem, or it can for you if you really don't know how to get going. And I've been playing around with this. It's kind of good at generating templates in particular, and people like templates. I have some in my book. Some of the most popular college composition courses, the books that they assign are books that offer you templates. People just really like to do that. Now, that said, the human touch is still needed. Like, that is a rough first draft. I would never treat anything that ChatGPT wrote as a final product. There are a couple of reasons why. One is the tone may not be right for your audience. Back to this point about audience, like, your whole point is for this writing to be effective, this communication to be effective. ChatGPT often can't internalize that. And it is still kind of a robot. So for example, and it can be kind of repetitive. I've noticed if you ask it to write you an email doing anything, no matter what that thing is, the first line in the email will be, "I hope this message finds you well." Well, if you did that every single time you wrote a message, especially to people who get your messages all the time, they would start to think you were a robot. So it just it doesn't quite have that nuance to it. Probably more importantly, though, than the repetitive tone issues are that it may not get the facts right. If you are counting on it to actually say anything of substance and this, I be very leery of this versus, write me the skeleton of an email that I'll then put all the substance into. You have to be very careful that it might get things wrong. It might have sourced it from somewhere that you're inadvertently essentially stealing the idea from. It's remixing content all over the place. So I'd be very careful about trusting it to tell you anything factual. And I also think it could still take a writing class. Let me just say that ChatGPT could. It does a lot of the using two words when one would do. So its writing has some needless words in it. Although there was a wonderful, there's an op-ed in the Washington Post recently from a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I believe. I think he was the one who suggested this, that he said, we should take something that ChatGPT wrote and have the students edit it as a I think it was this op-ed, I'm forgetting now. He said let's edit ChatGPT. That would be a learning exercise, and I think that's true. You could take something that ChatGPT wrote or another AI written document and ask students to critique it and find ways to make it better, because it isn't perfect, but it's inevitable. Is my bottom line. I don't know if that's yours.
Right. No, it sounds like you can see it. You could being used as a writing assistant, or trying to get over that sort of the blank page syndrome, trying to break through writer's block. All of that is very useful. And however, it's not usable. I mean, I've been playing around with it as well and having some fun. It is a little bit creepy, but it also is, could I could see the use for it. and how it could potentially save some time and some frustration, but it's not quite usable for me, but maybe for others. Others may decide to copy and paste it and publish and hit publish or send it. So that I think that's very, very likely in some cases. I think for me personally, and I think it sounds like for you as well, we can't quite take it and run with it and use it, which is a good thing. It's reassuring, but it promises to get even more powerful going forward. But I think my take is it's going to be a useful tool. It will get more powerful. It will replace some functions, basic functions, but at least for the next few years, it won't entirely replace humans. And beyond that, I'm not going to make any predictions. So,
Yeah. Especially when you talk about it generating content that would then be published, that creates kind of a pit in my stomach, because that means that what it's doing is thinking for you. And that feels like it crosses some line. And I know there's discussion of this, right? Can it create marketing content? Can it create all sorts of things that humans do? I'm much more interested in, again, the template type of use of it than having it be something that's actually, it's coming up with things that seem like ideas, but they're ideas crowdsourced from somewhere else. And then you take it, make some edits, put your name on it and put it out into the world and quote unquote publish it. That seems phony to me, in a way that using it to get you over a drafting problem when you're not sure how to structure a correspondence or outline an argument, that's a little different.
right. Absolutely. No, I certainly wouldn't advocate that. I personally find it, something that I would never consider doing, but I can see
Right.
where others may want to do that to save time and be more productive. But is there any other? Do you have any other advice for aspiring writers out there or professionals who are trying to improve their writing? I think you've packed a lot of advice in your book. I think that's I highly recommend listeners and out there go out and buy Martha's book. But anything else that you'd like to add?
The only thing I'd say is that if you think you want to write, especially for a new platform, whether that's LinkedIn or another social media platform, or you want to write an op-ed or blog post somewhere, just start reading what others are writing on that platform with an eye to what do you like and what styles seem to work and what sort, because each one of them has a different way of doing it. And I think the best way to learn is by observing and figuring, just, save the ones you like and say, this was really well done. Why did I like it so much? And you'll start to see patterns that'll make it easier for you to replicate, rather than just sort of saying an abstract, I want to write a brilliant LinkedIn post. So that's my other piece of advice, is there's sources of inspiration all around you, and just spend a little time gathering them, and it'll feel less daunting if you do that.
That's great. What books what did you learn from him? What would be sort of one or two books on writing that really sort of influenced the way you write?
Good question. And there's so many wonderful books out there, and each one of them sort of exists for a different reason. The one I mentioned, there was one I was using until I wrote my own, that was written by a couple advertising executives. It's called Writing That Works, by Roman and Rafelson. And it's really nice. It's advertising executives. And I first thought, well, that's funny, I'm teaching public policy, but all of it's about persuasion, and we're always selling. In public policy, you're selling an idea. In business, you're selling a good or service, but it's always about persuasion. And they do a really nice job of explaining that. I think Brian Garner's HBR Guide to Better Business Writing is a great resource as well. For data visualizations and decks, John Schwabish has a book called Better Presentations that I think is a great guide to how to streamline and strip down your bar graphs and line graphs and everything else, so that your reader really can see what's essential in them, and you can declutter them of the things that are not essential. I have a chapter in the book where I give some of the highlights of that, but John's book, Better Presentations, gets into that more deeply.
That's great. And then added to that is Writing on the Job, Best Practices for Communicating in the Digital Age by Martha Coven. So congratulations again on publication of your book. How does it feel?
It feels great. It feels really nice to, especially when people say, oh, I used this and it helped me with this problem. My favorite was, I got a cold outreach on LinkedIn from someone who is a public information officer out west, and said, this book is gold. It was what I was looking for. It helped me do my job. That's what I want. The book should be helping people do their jobs. So that's really the reward of having done it.
That's fantastic. Do you have a copy on hand? Can you hold it up?
Here it is.
Great. Writing on the Job, Best Practices for Communicating in the Digital Age by Martha Coven. Thank you for joining me on Write with Impact, Martha. What's the best way for people to reach you?
So on LinkedIn, I'm Martha B. Coven. That's C-O-V as in Victor, E-N. I'm also there on Twitter, and there's a website, writingonthejob.com, where you can find some of the commentary I've written and other companion resources.
Fantastic. It's an excellent book. Highly recommend it. Thank you so much, Martha, for joining.
Thanks for having me.